They told you this case was science, that 4 little girls born in the grey dawn of the Great Depression were nothing more than an improbable miracle, identical sisters, perfectly matched, a natural experiment written in human flesh. But that was the lie. The truth is darker and more dangerous. The Genain Quadruplets, the name given to them by psychiatrists who buried their real identities, were never just children. They were subjects, a living demonstration that madness could be summoned, observed, dissected. Their lives were sealed in files thicker than Bibles, their home turned into a stage, their very existence reduced to proof for an institution hungry to justify its power. Imagine this. 4 daughters, indistinguishable in the cradle, raised in a house where love was rationed like war rations, where control pressed down so tightly that individuality was erased before it had a chance to breathe. Now imagine those same daughters grown into women, locked in the National Institute of Mental Health, their blood drawn, their minds tested, their every word converted into numbers. That's not family, that's not medicine, that is surveillance dressed as science, captivity wrapped in white coats. You weren't supposed to hear this. The files were scrubbed clean of names, their hometown erased from the map, replaced with a ghost city called Envira, a nowhere land invented to protect the institution, not the sisters. They became symbols, not people, a warning carved into data sheets. Schizophrenia runs in the blood, but beneath those labels lies the real story, the father's tyranny, the mother's silence, the community's gaze, the medical machine's hunger to turn suffering into numbers. This isn't history, this is a mirror, and if you keep listening you will see yourself in it, because what was done to the Genain sisters was not unique. It was a template, a blueprint, for how institutions strip men and women of their names, their context, their will, until they are nothing but raw material. It is the same pattern you see in schools that break boys into obedience, in workplaces that reduce men to metrics, in governments that file entire populations into categories like livestock. 4 sisters, 1 diagnosis. But the truth is that their lives never matched the neatness of the charts. One collapsed entirely into institutions, another managed routines like a ghost moving through life, another swung between clarity and chaos, and one, the one they never talk about, survived with a spark still intact. The same bloodline, the same home, the same father, and yet 4 different outcomes. That should have shattered psychiatry's certainty. Instead, it was ignored, erased. The narrative was too useful to abandon. Science did not study them to understand them. Science studied them to prove itself right. And that is the real horror. When truth is sacrificed for power, when the complexity of human life is flattened into a single phrase, a single code, a single story. When you are no longer a man, but a case file. No longer a son, but a subject. No longer alive, but archived. The Genain Quadruplets were not just a mystery of genetics. They were the perfect demonstration of how control works. Control is never about discovering truth. Control is about deciding which truths are allowed to exist. So let me ask you, do you think this story ended with them? Do you think this was an isolated tragedy locked in dusty archives? No. This is the same architecture of power that governs your life right now. It begins with surveillance. It deepens with categorization. It ends with erasure. And every step of it is wrapped in the language of benevolence, protection, safety, science. The world you live in is still Envira. A map drawn to hide reality. A mask placed over your face. A script written for you before you even speak. The Genain sisters lived under the illusion of protection. They were told the spotlight was charity. They were told the institutions were help. They were told the files existed to secure their anonymity. But protection, when given by power, is always a leash. And the leash is always attached to a collar you did not choose. This is not just their story. This is the opening of the door. Tonight, I am not telling you about 4 women trapped in a genetic mystery. I am telling you about the system that still watches you, still measures you, still erases you. Their case was a laboratory. Your life is its continuation. Welcome to the descent. They were displayed like trophies before they could speak, and the roar of the crowd became the first sound they learned to answer. The county fair photographs are blunt evidence. 4 girls dressed the same, posed in identical stances, their faces arranged into the pleasing symmetry of a human exhibit. Beneath the gloss of smiling faces and charitable applause is a quieter violence, a lesson taught in light and lens. The world declared them a miracle, and the miracle required an audience. From the beginning, applause was traded for privacy, donations for exposure, kindness for a permanent script. The spectacle rewired the family's life the way a metal stamp reshapes soft clay, by imprint, by force, by an economy of attention that always demands a return. Inside the house, expectation had a single architect, their father. He was a man who believed order was moral law, and he practiced it with the certainty of a doctrinal zealot. Rules were not negotiated, they were decrees. Bedtimes, meals, dress, behavior, each became a ritualized test. Any deviation was met with correction, not conversation. The daughters learned to move like cogs, to synchronize their steps, to fold their voices into the pattern that would keep the weight of punishment at bay. The father's authority was not private. It was ritualized into the rhythms of the household. Waking, working, speaking, resting, all were scored against a standard that admitted no error. The lesson learned early was painful and simple. Obedience equals survival. Their mother performed another role entirely. She was caretaker and courier of calm, a presence so still that it became another instrument of governance. Her silence was not neutral. It spoke. The house was a theater of compliance, and she was the stagehand who kept the scenery in place. When neighbors looked through lace curtains and saw order, they praised her steadiness. Inside, that steadiness resembled resignation. The daughters watched her and learned that resistance had a cost too high to bear. She organized the schedules, smoothed the uniforms, approved the staged appearances, and in doing so, normalized the idea that the family's needs were met through visibility. Her quiet was complicity by preservation. There were no private moments that belonged solely to the children. Even play was scheduled, catalogued and sanctioned. Dolls were matched to their dresses. Games were taught with rules that could not be bent. Punctuality was praised as virtue. Spontaneity was punished as a threat. In such an environment, personality became dangerous. The sisters had to learn not to be different. To survive was to become a copy. The lesson embedded in their first years was simple and absolute. Sameness equals safety. Small acts of distinction were discouraged until distinction itself began to feel like disobedience. Public attention amplified what the household already enforced. Tours were arranged, visitors curated, reporters fed a story that framed the family as grateful and stoic. The charity mailed in exchange for visibility. The sisters grew up on stages where the public's benevolence had the sharp edge of surveillance. Cameras measured the distance between their smiles. Notes were taken on the angles of their heads. Benevolence in this context operated like a scientific instrument, calibrating, recording, noting. The community's goodwill was transactional, and the transaction carried a hidden clause. To be supported was to be observed. That trade created patterns of exposure that later institutions would find irresistible. The medical gaze arrived later, but it built on foundations already laid. When researchers entered the picture, they encountered children who were, in many ways, prepared for observation. The sisters could obey a protocol because obedience had first been learned at home. They could sit still for testing because stillness had been enforced with the weight of paternal will. That is the cruel logic the files rarely speak aloud. Institutions did not create the conditions of compliance. They inherited them and then amplified them. Observation turned into longer residencies. Annual checkups wavered into histories. Tests meant to measure became instruments that remade. Records from early childhood are not clinical summaries. They are inventories of compliance. Reports detail measured smiles, timed interactions, and the ease with which the sisters conformed to instructions. That conformity became evidence, used later to demonstrate hereditary patterns. But conformity itself is not inherited, it is taught. Behavior that looks like genetic destiny can be the product of pressure so constant it rewrites personality. To read those early notes is to witness a slow erasure of play, of unpredictability, of small insolences that make a child human. The apparent readiness for testing was not proof of nature. It was the after effect of enforced order. There were small resistances, moments that flicker like embers in a logbook of command. A diary entry here, a whispered joke there, the furtive clasping of hands behind backs. Gestures that never passed into public record, but carried the truth of interior life. The sisters found each other in those moments, a network of secret glances that suggested a private language. It is easy to dismiss these as childish rebellions, but within a system designed to flatten difference, every hidden smile was a theft from the household's authority. Those ember moments were the first proofs that identity could not be fully erased, that inside the imposed symmetry, individuals still smoldered. Yet the house also taught them a darker skill, to mimic normalcy so thoroughly that even trained observers could be deceived. One sister learned how to present competence, another learned how to construct a facade of emotion, a third discovered the economy of silence, saying enough to answer without revealing. This adaptability would later confuse clinicians. It would also be a form of survival. When medicine approaches suffering as a problem to be quantified rather than a life to be understood, mimicry becomes a defense. The patient learns to perform health the way an actor performs a role. Consider, too, the language of the time. The era's sciences loved certainties. Psychiatry sought models that could be neat and generalizable. A family where obedience had been hammered into ritual provided an irresistible case. The quadruplets presented a tidy hypothesis: identical genetics, similar upbringing, similar diagnosis. The narrative was seductive because it simplified complexity into a plausible cause, but reality resisted simplification. The differences between sisters were already present in Quo. 8 ways, an inclination towards stubbornness here, a capacity for imitation there, a latent resilience in one sibling that would later confound neat conclusions. This is the moment when compassion could have intervened. Parents could have been challenged. Community support could have respected privacy rather than exploiting spectacle. Early medical observers could have listened with humility. None of these interventions happened. Instead, the machinery of observation advanced, smoothing over contradictions, turning private ambiguities into public axioms. The sisters moved from the house into institutional hands as if passing from one theater to another. The lights changed, the audience shifted, but the performance demanded the same submission. Remember this: childhood is the seedbed of identity. Whoever tills that soil decides what will grow. The Genain sisters' early years were tilled by a father's iron order and a mother's quiet compliance, fertilized by public curiosity, and harvested by a medical profession eager for deliverable results. The consequence was not simply a diagnosis, it was a culture of compliance that followed them into adulthood, a blueprint by which their minds were read and their futures constrained. If you want to understand how institutions make truth, start here, where spectacle met discipline and where the first acts of erasure quietly took root. The next stage of their descent began not in a laboratory, but in a ledger. A name stripped away, a town erased, identities reduced to codes. They were no longer the Morlok daughters of Lansing, Michigan. They were now the Genain Quadruplets of Envira, USA. Envira, a town that never existed, conjured by psychiatrists as a false backdrop, an invented geography designed to sterilize their lives of context. This erasure was called protection, but you and I both know better. A mask does not protect the subject, a mask protects the watcher. To rename a family is to claim ownership, to redraw their hometown is to build walls around memory, cutting them off from the streets they walked, the neighbors who whispered, the soil that raised them. In the official reports, Lansing disappeared. In its place rose a fiction, a ghost town with no history, no gossip, no church bells, no courthouse, no graves. The sisters' real home was gone, as though their origins were a liability, an inconvenience to the narrative psychiatry wanted to write. The truth was locked away behind locked filing cabinets, classified in the name of ethics. But ethics was never the motive. Control was. Even their new name, Genain, was not chosen at random. It was lifted from Greek roots meaning dire birth. Think about that. Before a single psychiatrist sat across from them, before a single test was conducted, their identities had been branded with tragedy. They were labeled not as individuals, but as a cautionary tale. Their diagnosis was scripted before their first interview. The word Genain was a prophecy, not a name. This is how power works. It redefines reality by naming it. He who controls the language controls the frame. The sisters were not sick in the beginning. They were made into sickness. Once you label a life as pathology, everything that life produces will be interpreted as symptom. A smile becomes a mask, a silence becomes withdrawal, a thought becomes delusion. The institution writes the script, and the subject is forced to perform it. The sisters were catalogued as GQ1, GQ2, GQ3, GQ4, neat abbreviations that erased their humanity as efficiently as the pseudonym erased their town. 4 daughters became 4 case files, reduced to slots in an experiment. This is the same principle you see at work in prisons, in military training camps, in factories, in bureaucracies where names vanish into ID numbers. You are transformed into a unit, and once you are a unit, you can be studied, controlled, discarded. Their father had already rehearsed this erasure in the home. Identical dresses, synchronized routines, mechanical discipline. He had trained them into copies. By the time psychiatrists arrived, the pattern was already set. The institution merely absorbed it, systematized it, refined it. The girls had been taught to suppress individuality to survive their father's house. Now they were told to suppress individuality to fit the experiment. 2 cages, 1 continuous chain, and what of their mother? In the reports, she is little more than a shadow, a figure of silence. Observers described her as compliant, hesitant, unwilling to intervene, but silence is not neutrality. Silence becomes the oxygen in which control thrives. The mother did not break the order, she upheld it. She became the quiet confirmation that the father's word was law. For the daughters, that silence was a second prison, the absence of an ally, the absence of rescue, the confirmation that no one would stop what was happening. The psychiatrists framed all this as environmental factors, but they used the phrase like a whisper, a side note, never allowing it to challenge the official story of heredity. Why? Because their theory was more important than the sisters' reality. They wanted proof that madness was genetic, and so every detail that didn't fit was minimized, footnoted, ignored. The iron rule of the father, the suffocating gaze of the mother, the spectacle of the community. These forces could have explained the fractures in the daughters' minds. But to acknowledge that would be to admit that institutions themselves create madness, and psychiatry could not afford to confess its complicity. So the pseudonyms hardened, the town vanished, the names were replaced with codes, and the sisters became living evidence of a predetermined conclusion. Schizophrenia runs in the blood. But remember this, control always leaves a trace. In the margins of those clinical reports, you can still see the fractures where reality resisted. One sister was catalogued as fully impaired, another as partially functional, another as unstable but lucid in cycles, another as nearly independent. 4 outcomes, 4 variations, 4 contradictions. If madness was purely genetic, why were the outcomes so different? Why did one sister live with relative resilience while another was consumed? That question should have shaken psychiatry to its core. Instead, it was buried beneath the pseudonym. The contradictions were smoothed into the phrase, concordant for diagnosis, discordant for severity, a formula that sounds precise but means nothing. It is an evasion disguised as science. This is the sleight of hand you must learn to see. Institutions will never admit uncertainty when certainty secures their power. They will bury contradictions in technical jargon. They will invent towns to erase inconvenient contexts. They will rename you to fit their categories. They will call it ethics or science or safety. But underneath those words lies the same machinery, domination. Look closely and you'll see the same machinery operating in your life. Do you think algorithms don't rename you? Do you think corporations don't assign you categories, segment you into profiles, feed you back to yourself as data? Do you think governments don't erase context when they assign you labels that determine your worth? The sisters were not an anomaly. They were the prototype. What was done to them in the mid-20th century is now done to billions of people with far greater efficiency. The same reduction, the same erasure, the same illusion of anonymity that hides the true face of control. The Genain sisters' tragedy is that they lived long enough to be made into symbols, but never long enough to reclaim their own names. Their pseudonym still circulates in psychiatric literature. Their real identities remain buried in archives, stripped from the record, so that their humanity would not contaminate the purity of data. Even in death, the erasure persists, and this is where the lesson sharpens into a warning. Once an institution renames you, once it decides that your story belongs to its narrative, you cannot return unchanged. The sisters lived under that pseudonym for decades, and every page of their lives was filtered through it. You must ask yourself now, what names have already been placed upon you? What towns of fiction have you been relocated to without even realizing it? What labels are shaping the way others interpret your every act? Because the cage that confined the sisters has only expanded. It covers cities, nations, the entire digital map you inhabit. You think you are known, but you are categorized. You think you are protected, but you are masked. And every mask is a theft. This is not just their history. This is your present. And if you cannot see the chains being forged around you, then you are already living in Envira. The transfer from household to hospital was framed as rescue, but the rescue came with shackles. What had begun as spectacle for neighbors and journalists now matured into protocol for researchers. The Genain sisters, renamed, recoded, and reclassified, were relocated into the vault of the National Institute of Mental Health. There, they would become not simply patients, but the property of science. This shift was not accidental. It was the logical next step in a sequence that had always been about control. First the family, then the community, then the state. The institution had no interest in healing. It had interest in observation, and observation, under the guise of treatment, is simply surveillance with better lighting. The sisters entered a world of corridors painted pale green, fluorescent lights that never dimmed, clipboards that moved like weapons, and doors that opened only one way. Inside, the vocabulary changed, but the discipline remained. Instead of a father's decrees, they faced schedules printed in official timetables. Instead of neighborhood cameras, they faced clinical notes. Instead of whispered gossip, they faced peer-reviewed journals. The texture of control had shifted, but its purpose had not. To regulate, to document, to decide who they were. Consider the daily routines. Meals were timed and portioned. Interviews scheduled and repeated. Tests administered not once but endlessly, as though identity could be charted only through exhaustion. Questionnaires about hallucinations, memory games, word associations, ink blots. Each sister answering, each sister coded as data. The aim was not to understand them as individuals, but to extract patterns, measurable trends that could be fed into the machine of psychiatric theory. Their lives became numbers, their differences collapsed into graphs. This process had a particular cruelty. The sisters had grown up learning to suppress individuality to survive their father. Now the very survival strategy that once kept them safe became evidence against them. To answer alike was to confirm heredity. To answer differently was to confirm severity. Either way, the test always proved the hypothesis. You see the trap. Every possible outcome had been designed in advance to validate the experiment. One report describes how the sisters sat in a line during testing, their hair brushed to near uniformity, their dresses standardized by institutional issue. From the outside they appeared almost interchangeable. But within that sameness were fractures, nervous tics, furtive glances, a stiffness that revealed resistance. The institution did not record those fractures as humanity, it recorded them as symptom. The bureaucracy of diagnosis is efficient at converting rebellion into pathology. Think of the interviews. One sister, who displayed the most independence, spoke with careful precision, measuring every word. Observers noted her guarded responses, categorizing them as paranoia. But guardedness is not paranoia. It is defense. When every sentence is ammunition, silence becomes armor. Another sister, who smiled frequently, was classified as superficially cheerful with shallow affect. But maybe the smile was her last weapon, the only way she knew to puncture the cold air of the ward. What psychiatry coded as illness may have been survival, but survival does not fit neatly into a case study. The institution expanded its reach through documentation. Decade after decade, papers were published, each layering another interpretation over their lives. Onset of psychosis in identical quadruplets, genetic factors in schizophrenia, environmental stressors in a unique family. The titles varied, but the function remained the same: to turn lived experience into citation. Imagine your childhood, your memories, your daily struggles, transformed into footnotes in journals that strangers would read without ever knowing your face. Imagine your anguish flattened into a dataset that confirms theories rather than challenges them. That was the fate of the Genains, and still the contradictions leaked through. Not all four sisters lived the same fate. One remained institutionalized for life, dependent on routine and medication. Another cycled through hospitals, her condition fluctuating. A third lived on the margins of independence, holding jobs, but never fully escaping surveillance. And the fourth carved out something close to normalcy, marrying, raising children, insisting on a life beyond the diagnosis. 4 variations, 4 possible lives, a single case study that contained multitudes. This variance should have shattered the genetic narrative. If heredity were destiny, the outcomes would have been mirror images, but the institution could not allow that. Instead, it reframed the contradiction as nuance. Genetic loading expressed differentially under environmental stress, a phrase that means nothing and everything, designed to preserve the theory while ignoring the obvious. The sisters were individuals, not replications. The longer they lived under observation, the more their humanity disappeared from the record. Details of who they were, the books they liked, the songs they hummed, the gestures that made them unique, were rarely captured. What survived were only the measurable fragments, delusions catalogued, hospitalizations counted, medications listed. In this way, their identities were dismantled not only by the father and the community, but by the institution itself. Psychiatry replaced personhood with profile. It is here that the warning becomes clearest. Institutions do not simply study subjects, they remake them. They impose categories that dictate how the world will see you. Once those categories harden, they shape reality more powerfully than memory. The sisters were no longer seen as daughters, neighbors, women. They were seen as evidence. Their pseudonym became their prison. Their case file became their biography. Their diagnoses became their epitaphs. Ask yourself, how different is your life? When you enter a hospital, do you not become a patient ID? When you log into a system, do you not become a profile number? When you are categorized by algorithms, do you not become a data point? The sisters' tragedy is extreme, but it is not alien. It is a mirror of the processes that still surround you, refined now into invisible bureaucracy. And so the Genain case endures, not because it proves heredity, but because it proves the machinery of control. It shows how lives can be stripped, renamed, categorized, and displayed as truth. It shows how institutions build their authority not on compassion, but on compliance. It shows how erasure masquerades as protection, how exploitation disguises itself as science. The sisters lived as daughters, then as exhibits, then as patients, then as files. Their journey maps the stages of modern control: family discipline, social spectacle, medic, surveillance, bureaucratic erasure. Each stage did not replace the previous one, it deepened it. By the time they entered the NIMH, they were already prepared for the role. They had been rehearsed for decades. Remember, the true horror of the Genain story is not that 4 sisters suffered. It is that their suffering became a template, a demonstration, a model for how institutions could claim authority over identity itself. Their tragedy was not singular, it was systemic, and the system they revealed still breathes around you. By the time the institutional years stretched into decades, the 4 sisters no longer lived as a unit. They were the same by birth, raised in the same crucible, trained under the same paternal command, catalogued under the same pseudonym, yet their paths fractured into 4 distinct narratives. The official record treats these differences as degrees of impairment. But if you read closely, those differences are not proof of heredity. They are proof of individuality breaking through the chains of categorization. Let us trace them. The first sister, the one psychiatrists most often cite as the index case, became the emblem of deterioration. She cycled through hospital wards, her days regimented by medication trays, her body dulled by the chemical sedatives of mid-century psychiatry. Reports described her as chronically institutionalized, a phrase that sounds clinical but hides its violence. Chronic institutionalization is not an illness. It is a condition produced by the institution itself. When you are confined long enough, your world shrinks to corridors and routines. You are made dependent on the very system that claims to protect you. Her deterioration was not destiny written in her DNA. It was the consequence of captivity. The second sister moved in and out of hospitals, living on the boundary between containment and precarious freedom. She could work for stretches, sometimes in clerical jobs, sometimes in service roles, but the shadow of diagnosis followed her everywhere. Employers dismissed her at the first sign of instability. Landlords evicted her after whispers of illness reached the building. She lived in cycles: temporary stability, then collapse, then return to the ward. Psychiatry coded this as episodic exacerbation. But perhaps what they called exacerbation was simply exhaustion. The fatigue of a life lived under constant surveillance, constant threat of removal, constant reminder that her name was not her own. The third sister, the most outwardly resilient, managed to carve out a more conventional life. She married, had children, and insisted on independence. For decades, she refused to be reduced to the Genain file. When interviewed, she often minimized symptoms, presenting herself as functional, controlled, ordinary. Observers sometimes wrote that she was denying illness, as though independence itself was a form of pathology. But perhaps she was doing something braver, protecting her family from the predatory gaze of institutions, refusing to allow her children to be contaminated by the pseudonym that had consumed her youth. Her strategy was concealment, a calculated distance from doctors and journalists alike. She learned to play the role of normal because the cost of being honest was too high. The fourth sister existed in a space between shadow and survival. She did not achieve the independence of the third, nor the constant institutionalization of the first. She lived with relatives, moved between small towns, depended on networks of charity. Her life was quiet, but her quiet was not absence. It was a form of invisibility, a choice, or perhaps a necessity, to disappear from the gaze that had haunted her sisters. Because invisibility, unlike exposure, offers safety. You cannot be studied if you are not seen. You cannot be measured if you refuse to stand in the light. 4 sisters, 4 different fates, and yet psychiatry insisted they were one case. Concordant for schizophrenia, discordant for outcome. That phrase appears again and again in the literature. Concordant, discordant, a binary that erases the richness of difference, a binary that reduces lives to variations of a single script. But read beneath the jargon and you see the truth. Environment mattered, choice mattered, resilience mattered. The same genetic code produced 4 different realities because life is not a laboratory. Life resists neat conclusions. Think of what this variance reveals. If one sister could marry and raise children, then schizophrenia was not an inevitable totalizing fate. If another could work for years before collapse, then context shaped stability as much as biology. If one became chronically institutionalized, then captivity itself produced deterioration. And if another lived in near invisibility, then withdrawal was not symptom, but strategy. These lives prove what psychiatry refused to admit. Human beings are not test subjects. They are unpredictable, adaptive, contradictory. They are not models of disease, but stories of survival. And yet the case became famous precisely because it ignored these contradictions. For decades, textbooks cited the Genains as evidence of genetic loading. Lectures used them as illustrations of hereditary schizophrenia. Their pseudonym was invoked as shorthand for inevitability. Students were taught that the four sisters were proof of biology's supremacy over environment, but those students were never told about the father's iron rule, the mother's silence, the spectacle of the fairs, the exhaustion of surveillance, the divergent outcomes of adulthood. They were told a simplified myth, and myths, when repeated long enough, calcify into truth. The tragedy deepens when you remember that the sisters themselves were not silent. At times they spoke, resisted, tried to narrate their own stories. One sister wrote letters describing her longing for privacy. Another pleaded with doctors not to publish details of her life. Their voices existed, but the institution filtered them. Patient testimony was reframed as symptom, not as truth. A complaint became paranoia. A demand for privacy became hostility. Their own words could never outweigh the authority of the file. This erasure is perhaps the most haunting legacy of the case. To this day, if you search their pseudonym, you will find articles, papers, citations, but rarely their own voices. The archive has preserved the interpretation, not the experience. Their identities are still buried beneath jargon, their humanity obscured by the very name designed to protect them. And so their story continues to circulate as evidence, but not as memory. Pause here and consider what that means. What does it mean for a life to survive only as data? What does it mean for your struggles to be remembered only as symptoms, your individuality erased in the name of science? This is not only their fate, it is the fate of countless patients whose case histories fill the shelves of hospitals and universities. The system does not remember people, it remembers categories. It does not preserve humanity, it preserves pathology. And yet, despite the erasure, despite the pseudonym, despite the surveillance, the sisters' lives refuse to be reduced. Their very divergence is resistance. Their differences undermine the neatness of the institutional script. Their survival, however fragile, exposes the limits of psychiatry's power. The system tried to flatten them into proof of heredity, but their fates prove the opposite, that individuality endures even under the heaviest chains. In their later years, the surviving sisters aged into obscurity. Some lived quietly in Midwestern towns, their identities still guarded, their pseudonyms still shadowing them. Journalists occasionally tried to track them down, but most had no interest in revisiting the wound. They wanted lives, not legacies. They wanted anonymity, not attention. And perhaps that anonymity was the final act of rebellion. After decades of being displayed, studied, and reclassified, the greatest resistance was to disappear from view. So the Genain sisters fade from the record, not because their story ends, but because their story escapes. The archive holds the official version, pseudonyms, diagnoses, charts. But beyond the archive are the fragments of ordinary life. Dinners cooked, conversations shared, birthdays celebrated, children raised. Those fragments resist capture. They exist outside the file. And in that existence, however small, lies the truth psychiatry could never erase. The sisters were never one case. They were 4 lives, 4 worlds, 4 proofs that humanity exceeds the categories imposed upon it. By the 1960s, the Genain sisters had ceased to be daughters, neighbors, or even patients. They had become citations. Their pseudonym appeared in lecture slides, casebooks, and symposium papers, invoked as though it were not 4 living women but a scientific law. The Genain Quadruplets. The name itself acquired an aura of inevitability, a shorthand for hereditary madness. Medical students spoke it the way theologians speak scripture, as something beyond question, a text to be memorized rather than a story to be interrogated. But remember, citation is a form of power. To be cited is not to be remembered, it is to be used. Each time their case was referenced, it was not the sisters' humanity that circulated, but the authority of the institution that claimed them. They became a symbol, stripped of contradiction, mobilized to stabilize Psychiatry's reputation in a period when its authority was still fragile. This was the post-war moment when psychiatry needed evidence. The asylum system was collapsing, the old custodial warehouses exposed as inhumane. Psychopharmacology was just beginning to rise, promising control through chemicals rather than confinement. And genetics offered psychiatry something even more valuable, the chance to claim the mantle of science. If madness could be traced in bloodlines, then psychiatry was not merely managing deviance, it was uncovering biological truth. Enter the Genains. 4 identical sisters, 4 diagnoses. The case was irresistible. The sheer symmetry was too neat, too rhetorically powerful. Here was proof that genes, not families, not institutions, carried the weight of pathology. Never mind the contradictions, never mind that outcomes diverged, never mind that the sisters' upbringing was saturated with trauma and control. Those details were inconvenient. They cluttered the narrative. And science, or at least the version of science that craves authority, has little patience for clutter. So the textbooks presented a myth. The sisters were framed as a singular event, genetic destiny in human form. Paragraphs summarized their lives in precise but dehumanized language. Quadruplets, all diagnosed with schizophrenia by early adulthood, raised in the same environment, confirm the heritability of psychosis. That sentence, or some variant of it, spread through classrooms and lecture halls for decades. The nuances vanished, the contradictions dissolved. 4 lives were reduced to 1 bullet point. Think of what this reduction does. It takes suffering and converts it into lesson. It transforms individuality into evidence. It teaches future doctors to see, not people, but patterns. Students reading about the Genains were not invited to consider what it meant to be a child raised under paternal tyranny, a teenager paraded as spectacle, an adult monitored as data. They were invited only to marvel at the rare opportunity for science to observe heredity in action. The case became less a tragedy than a trophy, a prize that psychiatry displayed to prove its legitimacy. And this legitimacy had consequences. Policy debates in the 1960s and 1970s frequently cited the Genain case as justification for funding genetic research into mental illness. Grant proposals invoked their pseudonym as evidence that investment would yield results. Articles argued that prevention might one day be possible if only heredity could be mapped, measured, and controlled. The sisters, still alive, still struggling, were used as scaffolding for visions of a future in which madness could be eliminated before it began. Elimination. Think about that word. To eliminate illness sounds noble, but when the illness is defined in terms of heredity, elimination begins to blur with eugenics. If schizophrenia is genetic, then who should be allowed to reproduce? If madness runs in bloodlines, then what policies should control those bloodlines? These were not hypothetical questions. They were debated openly, sometimes explicitly, sometimes cloaked in the language of public health. And the Genain case sat at the center of those debates, silently underwriting arguments about which lives were worth continuing. The irony, and of course, is that the sisters themselves defied the narrative. One married and raised children, living a life psychiatry had declared nearly impossible. Another cycled between collapse and recovery, revealing that outcomes shift with time and context. Their lives were evidence not of inevitability, but of contingency. But contingency was not useful for the institution. Certainty was. So the contradictions were edited out, and the myth persisted. This myth shaped not only research, but also culture. Popular magazines picked up fragments of the story, framing it as a tragic curiosity. 4 Sisters, 4 Minds, read one headline. These articles rarely mentioned the father's tyranny or the mother's silence. They preferred the sensationalism of identical beauty corrupted by madness. Readers consumed the story as spectacle, no different than the county fairs of the sisters' childhood, only now mediated by glossy photographs and dramatic captions. Even outside psychiatry, the sisters were not free from display. Their suffering was entertainment, their tragedy a sideshow for the public's fascination with the uncanny. But perhaps the most haunting legacy of the case is its persistence. Even today, if you open certain textbooks or scientific reviews, you will still find their pseudonym invoked. You will still see the shorthand, the Genain Quadruplets, an identical set all diagnosed with schizophrenia. Their story continues to circulate, stripped of depth, reduced to confirmation of genetic loading. Decades after their deaths, they remain trapped in the same frame, unable to escape the narrative psychiatry imposed. Ask yourself, What does it mean for a person to survive only as a lesson? To exist in history only as evidence of pathology? This is the fate not only of the Genains, but of countless others whose lives have been collapsed into case studies. The psychiatric archive is filled with ghosts who can never speak back, their complexity flattened into categories, their names erased in the name of ethics, their humanity sacrificed to the altar of science. And yet, if you read carefully, the cracks remain. The contradictions in outcome, the hints of resistance, the fleeting gestures of individuality that psychiatry could not erase. These cracks are the true legacy of the Genains. They remind us that no theory, no institution, no archive can fully contain the messiness of human life. They remind us that certainty is always a mask, and that behind every mask is a story waiting to be reclaimed. So when you next hear their pseudonym invoked as proof of heredity, remember what has been lost. Remember the girls dressed alike for the county fair. Remember the father whose iron rules carved obedience into their bones. Remember the mother whose silence preserved order at the cost of freedom. Remember the sisters who diverged into 4 lives, each struggling, each resisting, each refusing to be identical. Remember that behind every citation is a human being, and behind every case study is a story of power, erasure, and survival. The Genain case did not prove genetics, it proved something else entirely. The ability of institutions to seize lives, rewrite them, and circulate them as truth. That is the real lesson, not about heredity, but about control. By the time the Genain sisters reached middle age, their names still hidden behind the veil of pseudonym, the psychiatric memento, Hakim had already extracted what it wanted from them. Their blood had been tested, their thoughts catalogued, their failures converted into charts. For the institution, the work was finished. But for the sisters themselves, life remained, fractured, heavy, but unextinguished. And it is here, in the shadows of their later years, that the true reckoning begins. Because the question we must ask is not simply what happened to them, but what happened through them. The Genain case did not end with the sisters. It became a prism through which psychiatry revealed its deepest instinct, to transform suffering into evidence, to transmute lives into instruments of power. The reckoning is not about genetics, the reckoning is about ethics. In the 1970s and 1980s, younger scholars began to revisit the Genain files. They were trained in a discipline already reshaped by psychopharmacology, by the retreat of the asylum system, by the rise of bioethics. These scholars opened the case expecting to see a triumph of genetic science. What they found instead was a labyrinth of contradictions, silences, and cruelties. They saw how the pseudonym itself, Genain, from the Greek for dire birth, had pre-written the sisters as tragic material. They saw how the invention of the town Envira had erased context, severing the sisters from their community and transforming their suffering into an abstract object of study. They saw how psychiatric certainty had required distortion, how the neatness of 4 diagnoses concealed the reality of 4 diverging lives. Some dared to speak it aloud. The Genain case revealed less about heredity and more about institutional hunger. Hunger for proof, hunger for authority, hunger for control. Consider what it means that the sisters' childhood testimonies were collected only through the lens of psychiatric interview, never through unmediated diaries or personal reflections. Every word they spoke was refracted through the categories of the observer. If a sister expressed distrust, it became paranoid ideation. If she withdrew into silence, it became flattened affect. If she resisted, it became non-compliance. Every gesture was coded in the language of pathology. At no point were they allowed to author their own narratives. The archive is a hall of mirrors, in which their voices echo only after translation into clinical terms. This is not science. This is colonization of the soul. The reckoning deepens when we realize that the case was never truly about 4 women at all. It was about psychiatry itself. In mid-century America, the field needed symbols to assert its scientific credibility, and the sisters were drafted into service. Their anonymity was not protection, but conscription. They were not shielded from public gaze. They were stripped of identity so the institution could gaze more freely, unburdened by the mess of biography. Their pseudonym was not mercy. It was ownership, and this ownership echoes forward. Even today, scholars wrestle with whether their case can be cited without perpetuating its violence. Can we ever speak the word Genain without reinforcing the mask? Or must the very act of repeating their pseudonym be recognized as complicity in their erasure? The reckoning is not clean. It forces us to see that language itself can be a chain, that naming and renaming can be weapons sharper than scalpels. But here is the most unsettling truth. The Genain sisters were not unique. They were merely visible. Countless other families were studied, measured, and written into oblivion. What made the Genains extraordinary was not their suffering but their utility. They were identical, symmetrical, narratively perfect. That perfection made them valuable. But for every Genain case that became famous, dozens more languished in obscurity, their files sealed, their stories forgotten. The archive of psychiatry is an archive of hidden lives, lives that never received even the grim immortality of pseudonym. So when we speak of reckoning, we are not speaking of one case. We are speaking of a system that transforms the personal into the institutional, the intimate into the bureaucratic, the living into the archived, a system that consumes individuals to manufacture authority. Think carefully about this, because the pattern extends beyond psychiatry. The same logic governs how governments treat their citizens, how corporations treat their workers, how militaries treat their soldiers. You are not a man, you are a data point. Not a soul, a statistic. Not a voice, a file. The Genain sisters were the template, but you are the continuation. And this is where the ethical reckoning cuts deepest. It forces us to ask, what does it mean to be seen by power? The sisters were always seen, by neighbors who treated them as curiosities, by journalists who treated them as spectacles, by doctors who treated them as specimens. They were seen constantly, but never truly recognized. That is the paradox of surveillance. It magnifies you while erasing you. The gaze of power is not about acknowledgement, it is about use. The reckoning, then, is not simply about correcting history, not simply about naming the cruelties of the past. It is about learning to resist the gaze. It is about reclaiming the power to narrate oneself. The Genain sisters could not escape the categories imposed on them, but you, hearing this now, still have a chance. Midway through this descent, I want you to lock in that recognition. Write it in the comments so the world can see you breaking the mask. The phrase is this: I am not your case file. Write it twice, as an oath and as an act of resistance. Once for yourself, once for the algorithm that still surveils you. I am not your case file. I am not your case file. This symbolic act is not trivial. It is the opposite of what was done to the Genains. They were silenced. You are speaking. They were flattened. You are asserting depth. They were archived. You are resisting categorization. By commenting, you create a crack in the system's attempt to reduce you to data. You prove that awareness is still possible. The Genain case teaches us that once a life is captured by the archive, it rarely escapes. But you are hearing this before that capture is complete. You still move in the space between anonymity and surveillance. You still have choices, and the first choice is to refuse to be flattened. The reckoning, in the end, is not for the sisters. Their fate is sealed. The reckoning is for us. It is for those who inherit their story, who see in their erasure the shadow of our own. To remember them is to confront the system that consumed them. To remember them is to recognize the cage before it closes on us. The archive tells us the Genain sisters proved heredity, but the deeper record tells another truth. They proved the danger of surrendering narrative to power. That is their legacy. That is the fire that still burns beneath the ash. And if you feel that fire stirring in you now, then you are already beginning the transformation the institution never wanted you to make. To understand the full weight of the Genain case, we must place it inside a wider map, a lattice of experiments, programs, and hidden agendas that stretched across the mid-20th century. Because the sisters were not an isolated curiosity, they were part of an ecosystem of control, an era when psychiatry, government, and covert institutions aligned to push the boundaries of what could be done to human minds. Let's widen the lens. The 1950s and 1960s were the high tide of the Cold War. Every discipline, every laboratory was conscripted into the service of national defense. Physics gave us the bomb, computer science gave us code breaking, and psychiatry was asked to deliver something just as potent: mastery of the human psyche. If weapons could win battles, minds could win wars. The enemy was not only external, the Soviets, the Chinese, but internal, the possibility that loyalty itself could be reprogrammed. This was the climate into which the Genain case was absorbed. On the surface, their story was about heredity and schizophrenia. But beneath the surface, the case resonated with questions that haunted the era. How do we control behavior? Can we predict breakdown? Can madness be engineered or prevented at will? Those same questions fueled secret projects like MK-Ultra, the CIA's sprawling network of psychological experiments. Under its umbrella, psychiatrists dosed patients with LSD, sometimes without consent, to study mind fracture and control. Electroshock was escalated to destructive intensities, erasing memory in the hope of writing new identities onto blank slates. Sleep deprivation, sensory isolation, hypnosis. Every method was tested, and always the same justification: national security, the promise of creating a human subject who could be controlled like a machine. Do you see the echo? The Genain sisters were not drugged by the CIA, but the logic was identical. Reduce the subject to data, strip context, translate experience into variables. Whether in a state hospital ward or a covert laboratory, the person disappears and only the case remains. One of the most chilling overlaps was geography. Some of the most notorious MK-Ultra sub-projects were funneled through hospitals and universities where psychiatric research already flourished. Files from these projects often carried the same clinical language as the Genain reports: detached, precise, sterilized. A subject convulsing under shock became an interesting response to stimulus. A sister weeping under her father's gaze became an episode of effective lability. The rhetoric of science made cruelty palatable, and let us not forget, much of this was public before it was secret. State hospitals in the United States routinely performed experiments on patients considered expendable. In some asylums, schizophrenic patients were injected with malaria, syphilis, or hepatitis just to test treatments. In others, they were lobotomized in the name of progress, their consent neither sought nor considered relevant. The Genains, by sheer accident of being identical, escaped some of these extremes, but their lives were consumed in another way, as objects of endless observation. The key point is this: psychiatry in the mid-century was not simply a healing profession. It was a system of experimentation embedded in a society obsessed with control, and here is where the reckoning sharpens. We must see how the sisters' case helped naturalize the broader apparatus. By citing the Genains as proof of genetic determinism, psychiatry could justify surveillance of families, cataloging of heredity, and even whispers of preventive detention. If madness ran in the blood, then wasn't it reasonable to track bloodlines? If 4 sisters could become a public burden, shouldn't the state step in earlier to prevent the spread of pathology? The logic slips easily from science into governance, from clinic into control. This is why the Genain myth was so powerful. It offered a narrative of inevitability that aligned perfectly with institutional desires. The state wanted predictability, psychiatry wanted legitimacy, the CIA wanted pliability. Genetics seemed to promise all three, and so the sisters, stripped of their voices, became fuel for a machine larger than themselves. But again, contradictions. The Cold War projects promised mastery, yet what they produced was often chaos. LSD experiments led not to reliable brainwashing, but to shattered minds. Shock therapies erased memory but left only ruin. And the Genain sisters? Their lives resisted neat categories. One worked, one mothered, one resisted treatment, one endured. The myth was clean, but the reality was stubbornly messy. That messiness matters. It reveals the fault lines in the system. Power thrives on neatness. The clean report, the decisive chart, the singular conclusion. Mess disrupts it. Mess reminds us that human beings cannot be collapsed into equations. The Genain's divergence was a crack in the facade, proof that even under total observation, life exceeds control. But the machine adapts. When cracks appear, power shifts strategies. By the 1980s, psychiatry had pivoted from family studies to molecular genetics, from surveillance of households to mapping of DNA. The sisters were cited less often, but their legacy lingered in the form of research priorities, massive projects to hunt schizophrenia genes, massive funding to prove that biology, not society, explained madness. The Genain myth was no longer needed as spectacle. It had already done its work. This is why we must not let their story vanish into the archive, because it is not only about psychiatry, it is about the way institutions consume lives to build authority, the way narratives of inevitability are weaponized to justify control. The sisters' tragedy is a microcosm of a larger pattern that touches us. Still, the reduction of the self into data streams, the translation of individuality into risk profiles, the endless appetite of systems that demand predictability at any cost. And here, I ask you to pause, because this story is not just history, it is a mirror. Look at the way algorithms track your movements, the way corporations harvest your preferences, the way governments profile your loyalties. Different tools, same logic. You are not Alice, Betsy, Cecilia, or Doris. You are user 174A, demographic cluster 9, predictive outcome 62%. The Genains were the past tense of this process. You are its present. The reckoning, then, must extend beyond psychiatry into the fabric of control itself. We must ask, how do we break the cycle? How do we resist being flattened into case files, into data points, into predictable variables? The first step is recognition. The second is refusal. And refusal begins small. Refuse to repeat their story as proof of heredity. Refuse to let your own story be narrated solely by institutions. Refuse the reduction, the flattening, the neatness. Speak your contradictions aloud. Preserve your mess, because the mess is where freedom lives. The Genain sisters were drafted into a system that could not tolerate contradiction, but contradiction is precisely what made them human. If we can learn to protect that messiness, in ourselves, in others, we can begin to unravel the machinery that consumed them. The next section will go deeper into this resistance, the ways survivors, scholars, and ordinary people have worked to reclaim stories from the archive, to expose the hidden abuses, and to honor the voices that were silenced. By the late 1980s, the walls of secrecy around psychiatry and Cold War experimentation began to crack. Declassification hearings exposed fragments of MK Ultra. Survivors of institutional abuse found the courage to testify. Families sued hospitals that had used their loved ones as experimental fodder. The archive, once sealed, began to leak, and through those leaks the wider world saw what had always been true. The line between treatment and control was far thinner than anyone wanted to admit. The Genain sisters' files were revisited in this climate. Researchers combed through the reports, now with eyes sharpened by awareness of past abuses. They noticed what had been overlooked: the father's authoritarian cruelty, the mother's silence, the relentless surveillance that shaped the sisters' every gesture. Suddenly, what had been framed as genetic inevitability looked like something else, a case study in how environment, trauma, and power distort the mind. The myth of heredity fractured. The case no longer looked like proof of genes, but like proof of psychiatry's blind spots. Yet sisters themselves did not live to see this reframing fully realized. Their later years passed quietly, each in her own shadowed orbit. There were moments of resilience, one raising children, another insisting on independence. But there was no triumphal arc. Their lives, like most lives, were messy, unresolved, and unfit for tidy conclusions. The tragedy is that the world never granted them the dignity of being ordinary. From the moment of their birth, they were spectacle, citation, and proof. They were never simply allowed to be women. What do we do with this story now? We cannot give the sisters back what was stolen. We cannot return to them the voices flattened into clinical notes, the choices erased by paternal control, the freedom denied by institutional hunger. But we can refuse to let the myth stand unchallenged. We can insist that the Genain case teaches us not about heredity, but about power. The power to seize narrative, to dictate meaning, to erase contradiction. This is where memory becomes resistance. To remember the sisters as more than a case file is to defy the archive. To say their pseudonym with awareness of its violence is to crack the mask. To speak their contradictions, one married, one resisted, one collapsed, one endured, is to honor the messiness that psychiatry tried to erase. And here is where you enter. Because this story is not entertainment. It is transmission. You are holding a fragment of history that was never meant to be fully told. The question is what you will do with it. If you allow it to remain only a curiosity, then the institution wins again. The sisters become once more spectacle. But if you take it as mirror, as warning, as evidence of how power consumes lives, then the cycle begins to crack. So pause now. Feel the weight of this. And if you want to make the refusal tangible, write this in the comments. I will not be reduced. Say it once for the sisters who could not. Say it again for yourself, before the algorithm writes your story into a pattern you did not choose. I will not be reduced. I will not be reduced. This ending is not resolution. It cannot be. Resolution belongs to neat narratives, to myths, to archives that pretend closure. The sisters' lives do not close neatly, and neither should our telling of them. What remains instead is tension, between memory and erasure, between science and cruelty, between spectacle and silence. But within that tension lies possibility. Because the Genain sisters remind us of something institutions fear, that even under total observation, life exceeds control. They remind us that no matter how neatly power arranges its categories, contradictions persist. They remind us that survival itself, fractured, uneven, incomplete, is a kind of resistance. So let this be the final image, not the sisters as case study, not as spectacle, not as pseudonym. See them instead as four women walking divergent paths, messy and unresolved, defying the neatness imposed upon them. See them as proof not of heredity but of humanity, fragile, stubborn, irreducible. And if you carry that image forward, then the sisters have escaped, in some small way, the cage psychiatry built for them.